A peninsula that just point blank refused to be swallowed up by its massive neighbor, China.
Hmm, fascinating.
Yeah, our main source for this deep dive, a text on East Asian history. And it's just jam-packed with stories of China's attempts again and again to conquer Korea.
Right, right.
So the big question is, how did this little peninsula, how did it hold out for so long against a power like China?
Well, that's what we're going to be looking at today.
Yeah, buckle up, because we're going to uncover some pretty surprising answers. Things like mountain fortresses, some seriously clever diplomacy, and even a few unexpected allies along the way.
Yeah, you know, what really gets me about Korea's story is it kind of flips the script on how we usually think about history. You know, we tend to assume that huge empires just gobble up smaller nations. It's kind of inevitable.
Right, yeah. That's the usual story. The big fish eats the little fish.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. But Korea just throws a wrench in that whole narrative.
Oh,
It's
yeah.
this story of resilience, strategy, and it really makes you question how power dynamics actually work.
Absolutely. The source actually describes China's expansion in East Asia. It says it was like devouring nations like dumplings.
Hmm, that's a good one.
But Korea was that one dumpling that just kept slipping off the chopsticks.
That's a perfect analogy. And it's worth remembering China's expansion, it wasn't, just for the sake of it. There were all these complex internal pressures, population growth, resource needs.
Right. So it wasn't just like, ooh, we want more land.
Exactly. Even political rivalries within China itself.
Hmm.
Sometimes conquest, it was seen as a way to to appease those internal pressures, a way to keep things stable within China.
So it wasn't just about brute force. There was a deeper game going on.
Hmm.
Okay, so let's rewind the clock.
Okay.
The source starts with Emperor Wu of the Han Dynasty, around 100 BC. Now this guy, he'd already conquered huge amounts of territory, and Korea was next on his list. But as we know, Korea wasn't like this unified country. It was more like a bunch of separate kingdoms, often fighting with each other.
So how did Emperor Wu, how did he approach this kind of fractured landscape?
Well, Emperor Wu, he saw that division, and he saw it as an opportunity. He played these kingdoms against each other, hoping to weaken them, make them easier to conquer.
Right, the old divide and conquer strategy.
Classic. And at first, he did have some success. He set up a few commanderies, these military outposts within Korea.
But wait, the source mentioned something called mountain fortresses.
Right.
So was the terrain of Korea, was that a factor in this whole struggle?
Oh, absolutely. Korea's mountainous terrain, it was key to their defense, but it wasn't just the mountains themselves. It was how the Koreans used them. They built these super elaborate fortresses strategically placed in those mountain passes.
So they were using the landscape to their advantage. Yeah, these weren't just, simple walls. They were complex structures, and they were really designed to maximize defense. Imagine trying to siege a fortress, and it's perched on top of this steep, winding mountain path.
Yeah, that's a nightmare.
Logistical nightmare for any invading army.
Okay, so it wasn't just passive defense. These fortresses were actively used to push back against the invaders. But did Emperor Wu's forces, did they just give up and go home? Did they not try to adapt their strategy?
Well, that's where we see some of the limitations of how ancient armies thought. China's armies, they were used to fighting on open plains. They relied on their superior numbers, their resources. They weren't ready for this kind of guerrilla warfare that the Koreans used, using the terrain, to their advantage.
So basically they were outmaneuvered.
Exactly. They struggled to adapt to this whole new style of fighting.
So the Han Dynasty, they kind of underestimated the power of geography, the power of a determined opponent, maybe both.
Yeah, you could say that. The Han commanderies in Korea, they were constantly under attack. Their supply lines were harassed. Troops were demoralized.
Not a good situation.
Not at all. And most of those commanderies, they crumbled after Emperor Wu died, just overwhelmed by Korean resistance. The Han, they did hold on to a small part of Korea for a while, but eventually even that was lost.
It seems like a classic case of, biting off more than you can chew.
Yep.
Speaking of which, let's jump ahead a few centuries to the Sui dynasty. They tried the same thing in 581 AD, but this time they went all in, right?
Oh, they did. Emperor Wen, maybe he was overconfident, maybe he felt the need to prove himself, but he launched this massive invasion of Korea. We're talking over 1 million troops.
1 million.
Even by today's standards, that's a huge force. Imagine trying to move, feed, coordinate 1 million soldiers in the 6th century AD.
Yeah, the logistics alone, that's mind-boggling.
Staggering.
1 million troops, that's almost unfathomable. It sounds like they were trying to just flatten Korea under the sheer weight of their army. Did that shock and awe approach, did it work?
Not at all. Actually, the Sui dynasty's invasion of Korea, it's considered one of the most disastrous military campaigns in history.
Wow.
They suffered defeat after defeat. Their massive army just bogged down by the same stuff that plagued the Han, difficult terrain, fierce resistance, and their own logistical shortcomings.
So it backfired spectacularly.
Spectacularly.
Wow. Talk about a military blunder, like, of epic proportions.
Yeah.
So was this epic failure the end of the Sui dynasty?
Well, it definitely didn't help. This costly, humiliating defeat, it weakened the Sui dynasty considerably, and it definitely contributed to its collapse just a few years later. It's a stark reminder that military might alone, it doesn't guarantee success. You need more than that.
It seems like the Tang dynasty, who came after the Sui, they learned a valuable lesson from this whole debacle. They took a different approach.
Right. They did. The Tang, they were known for being more strategic, adaptable in their warfare, and they realized brute force just wasn't going to work against Korea. So they went for a more cunning approach. They decided to play the political game, pit those Korean kingdoms against each other.
Right.
They formed an alliance with one kingdom, promised them support in their rivalries with the others. It was clever, exploit those existing tensions, weaken Korea from the inside.
Divide and conquer.
Classic strategy.
But did the Koreans fall for it?
At first, yeah. The Tang strategy was pretty effective. They managed to subdue a good number of Korean kingdoms with the help of their ally. But then comes the twist. Once a good chunk of Korea was under Tang control, the Koreans, they pulled off this remarkable move. They turned on their former Tang allies.
Wow.
And they did it using a tactic that might surprise you. Starvation.
Starvation. How did that work?
The Koreans realized they couldn't beat the Tang head-on, in a direct fight, so they decided to cut off their supply lines. They used their knowledge of the terrain to disrupt the flow of food resources to the Tang armies. They essentially trapped them. Imagine you're a Tang soldier. You're thousands of miles from home, and your food supply is dwindling. The impact on morale, it would have been devastating.
Yeah, that's a psychological blow as much as anything.
Absolutely.
So they outsmarted the Tang, a dynasty known for its military prowess, using a tactic that played to their strengths, their knowledge of the land, their willingness to adapt.
Exactly. The Tang, facing starvation and mounting losses, they were forced to retreat. It was a victory for Korea, a real testament to their ability to think outside the box, exploit their enemies' weaknesses.
So as a recurring theme here, Korea, even though they were smaller, had fewer resources than China. They constantly found ways to even the odds.
Yeah, that's a sharp observation, and it's something we'll see play out over and over in Korean history. They understood that survival, it often meant adapting to their circumstances, finding creative solutions to what seemed like impossible challenges.
So what happens next? Does the Tang dynasty just give up on Korea? Or do they try another approach? We'll find out in part 2 of our deep dive. Welcome back to our deep dive. Last time, we saw how Korea, they basically outsmarted the mighty Tang dynasty, instead of packing, tails between their legs. So, did the Tang just give up after that humiliating defeat?
Well, not completely, but they did realize that trying to conquer Korea outright, it was more trouble than it was worth. And this is where we get to this really interesting chapter in Sino-Korean relations, the tribute system.
Okay, tribute. So, was this like Korea just paying protection money to China? So they wouldn't get invaded again?
It was a little more nuanced than that. The tribute system, it was this whole complex web of diplomacy, economics, even cultural exchange.
Right.
So Korea would send gifts to the Chinese court, often really valuable stuff like gold, silk, sometimes even skilled artisans. And this was their way of acknowledging China's, their superior position in the region.
So it wasn't about total submission, more like a symbolic gesture, kind of showing respect.
Exactly. And in return for these tributes, the Chinese emperor, he'd grant Korea a certain degree of autonomy.
Yeah.
Basically, he was saying, okay, you can rule yourselves internally.
Right.
It was a way for both sides to keep the peace, maintain stability, without resorting to constant warfare.
But was it really a choice for Korea? Or was it, the least bad option, given how powerful China was?
That is a great question. And to be honest, it's a debate that historians are still arguing about today. Some say Korea, they had no choice but to accept this tributary relationship. Others, they see it as a strategic move on Korea's part, a way to secure peace and maintain their cultural independence.
It's fascinating to think about the discussion that must have happened in the Korean court. to fight or to pay tribute. That must have been a tough call. But this tribute system, did it actually work? Did it stop the conflicts between Korea and China?
Well, it definitely helped to cut down on those big invasions. But, there were still some periods of conflict. For example, in the 11th century, even with the tribute system going on, China, they launched 3 separate attempts to conquer Korea.
Wow.
And remember those mountain fortresses we talked about?
Right.
Well, they proved their worth once again.
So even with all that tribute going to China, they still couldn't resist trying to just take over completely. It seems like those mountains were a real pain in their side.
They were. And every time the Chinese armies, they just got bogged down by Korea's defenses. They couldn't make any real progress. And in the end, they'd settle for these quick peace negotiations, which let them, save face, go home without suffering a total defeat.
I can just picture those Chinese generals, just shaking their fists at those mountains. But speaking of, seemingly unstoppable forces, didn't they eventually conquer Korea?
Ah, yes, the Mongols. They were a force unlike any other in history, really. Their empire, it stretched across huge parts of Eurasia, and their military tactics, incredibly effective. Even Korea's mountains, they couldn't hold them back forever.
So how did they finally break through Korea's defenses?
It wasn't easy, even for the Mongols. They launched 8 separate invasions of Korea over a period of 30 years. It was brutal, relentless. Eventually, just the sheer persistence of the Mongols, combined with their superior military technology and tactics, it just wore down Korean resistance.
8 invasions, that's incredible. It really shows how determined they were. But even then, the Koreans, they didn't just surrender completely, did they?
No, they didn't. Even in defeat, the Koreans, they showed their resilience, their diplomatic skills. They negotiated terms with the Mongols that let them keep their ruling dynasty, even though, they were under Mongol overlordship.
So even under Mongol rule, there was still a sense of Korean autonomy.
To a certain extent, yeah. And it's important to remember, the Mongols, even though they were ruling China at this point, they weren't ethnically Chinese. They were their own distinct cultural and political entity. So Korea being part of the Mongol Empire, it wasn't directly under Chinese control the same way it had been, during the Han or the Tang dynasties.
That's a subtle but important difference. It keeps our focus on China's attempts to conquer Korea specifically, rather than getting sidetracked by other empires. So what happens after the Mongols? Does Korea go back to that tribute system with China?
That's exactly what happens. After the Mongol Empire breaks apart and the Ming dynasty comes to power in China, Korea goes back to that tributary relationship. It seems like after centuries of, trying different things, both sides just settled on the tribute system as the most stable and mutually beneficial arrangement.
And did the Ming dynasty, did they ever try to pull a fast one on Korea like some of their predecessors?
It's interesting, they didn't. The Ming dynasty actually showed a surprising amount of support for Korea. For instance, when Japan launched 2 huge invasions of Korea in the late 16th century, the Ming dynasty, they sent troops and resources to help fight off the invaders.
Wow, so they actually helped them out.
Yeah.
So the tribute system wasn't just about taking resources from Korea, it actually had some benefits for them too.
Exactly. The Ming dynasty, they saw Korea as this valuable buffer state, protecting their own borders from potential threats like Japan. So they had a real interest in keeping Korea stable and independent. It was a relationship built on pragmatism, on a shared interest in regional security.
It's amazing how this whole dance of power and diplomacy played out over centuries. But didn't things change eventually? Did Korea eventually lose its independence?
Yes, sadly, Korea's long period of independence came to an end in the late 19th, early 20th centuries. And this is where we get a real twist in the story. You remember how we've been focusing on China trying to conquer Korea?
Right.
Well, it wasn't China that ended up annexing Korea. It was Japan.
Japan, that's a real curveball. How did that happen? I thought Japan and Korea were on pretty good terms, especially after the Ming dynasty helped them with those Japanese invasions.
Well, the whole geopolitical scene in East Asia, it changed drastically in the late 19th century. Japan, they went through this period of super fast modernization and industrialization. They became a major military power.
Right.
And they were really eager to show their dominance in the region. And Korea, they were weakened by internal divisions. They were struggling to modernize as quickly as Japan, so they became, a prime target.
So did they launch a full-blown invasion of Korea? Was it this bloody conquests.
Surprisingly, no.
Yeah.
After they beat China in the First Sino-Japanese War in 1895, Japan, they first established a protectorate over Korea. Basically, Korea became a puppet state, controlled by Japanese interests. Then, just 5 years later, in 1905, Japan formally annexed Korea, officially ended their long period of independence, and it all happened without a major war.
That's almost more tragic, in a way. After centuries of fighting off Chinese invasions, Korea's independence just slipped away through these political maneuvers, this power vacuum at the wrong time. It makes you wonder, if Korea had been stronger internally, could they have resisted Japan?
It's a question historians still debate, yeah. But one thing's certain, Korea's story, it really shows how unpredictable history can be, how the tides of power are always shifting.
It's a good reminder that even the most resilient nations, they can be vulnerable to pressure from outside, especially when you're facing an adversary that's determined, technologically advanced. So where do we go from here? Does Korea just fade into the background, become part of the Japanese empire?
Well, the story doesn't end there. The Korean spirit, that resilience, it didn't vanish under Japanese rule. It showed up in different forms of cultural and political resistance. And then in the 20th century, Korea, they faced even bigger challenges. World War II, the division of the peninsula, and the emergence of, two very different Koreas. But that's a story for another deep dive.
Definitely a story for another time.
Yeah.
But before we move on to part 3, I just want to take a second to really appreciate how remarkable Korea's story is. For over 2,000 years, they managed to keep their independence. They navigated this really complex geopolitical landscape with incredible skill, determination.
It's a real testament to their strategic thinking, their adaptability, and their unwavering commitment to keeping their unique identity.
They were masters at playing the game of power. They used their strengths, exploited their enemies' weaknesses. But it's more than just, military and diplomatic achievements. Korea's story, it also highlights how powerful culture is, how it can endure even under immense pressure. They took in foreign influences, adapted them, made them their own, and they created this vibrant and distinct cultural heritage that's still thriving today.
And that brings us to a really important question. How did Korea manage to preserve its cultural identity, its distinct Koreanness, even though they were, right between two powerful cultures like China and Japan? That's the fascinating question we'll be exploring in part 3 of our deep dive.
Welcome back to our deep dive into Korea. We've been unraveling this incredible story, a peninsula that just refused to be taken over, fought off invaders, played the diplomatic game expertly, and ultimately carved their own path. But as we wrap up, I keep coming back to this one question. How did Korea manage to hold on to their cultural identity while being right in between these two massive cultural powerhouses, China and Japan? It's like a historical magic trick, you know what I mean?
Yeah, it's a question that really gets to the core of Korea's resilience. It forces us to think of culture not as something that just sits there, but as something that's always moving, changing, evolving. Korea didn't just block those outside influences. They took them in, they adapted them, and they made them uniquely Korean.
So instead of building walls, they created this kind of cultural filter.
Right.
They could take what they needed, but still keep their own distinct flavor. But were there ever times when they were worried about losing their identity in all this cultural exchange? I mean, especially with China, they had a huge cultural influence on Korea throughout history.
Oh, absolutely. There were definitely periods of tension, especially when China tried to impose their language, their writing system, or Confucian ideals on Korea. But even then, the Koreans, they found ways to assert their own cultural identity.
Mm.
Well, they developed their own unique writing system, Hegel, and it's still used today.
Wow.
They took Confucianism and they adapted it to fit their own social and political context. So they created this distinct form of Korean Confucianism.
Makes sense.
And maybe most importantly, they held on to their own language, which was like this powerful anchor for their cultural identity.
So it wasn't about just rejecting anything foreign. It was about being choosy, deciding what to take in and how to make it fit their own needs, their own values.
Exactly. Think about Korean art.
Okay.
Throughout history, Korean artists were influenced by both Chinese and Japanese styles,
Right.
but they always found ways to work in their own unique aesthetics, their own sense of beauty. You can see it in their ceramics, their paintings, even their architecture.
I'm seeing a pattern here. It's like this constant back and forth, absorbing those influences from the outside, then reasserting their own cultural identity. It's almost like a dance.
That's a great way to put it. And that dance is still going on today. Think about modern Korean culture. K-pop, Korean cinema, Korean fashion,
Right.
they're all super popular all over the world.
Yeah. Globally.
But they all have this distinct Korean feel, this blend of tradition and modern stuff. That's why it's captivating audiences everywhere.
Yeah, they've got their own style, that's for sure. It's really amazing to see how this historical pattern of cultural adaptation and innovation, it's still happening today in the
Hmm.
21st century.
Yeah.
But let's step back for a minute. Why should we, today care about a peninsula holding off empires hundreds of years ago? What can Korea's story teach us now?
Well, Korea's story, it reminds us that survival, whether it's physical or cultural, it often comes down to being able to adapt. It's about finding ways to use your strengths, to learn from what you've been through, and to constantly evolve as things change around you. That's a lesson that applies to everyone, not just nations.
Right. Yeah.
To individuals, businesses, anyone facing challenges in a world that's complex, that's always changing.
It's about being that dumpling that keeps dodging the chopsticks, right?
Yeah.
But on a serious note, it's about having that resilience, that ability to
Yeah.
bend without breaking.
Exactly. And Korea's story, it also reminds us that culture has this enduring power. It's something worth fighting for, worth preserving, worth celebrating. It's what links us to our past, shapes who we are, gives us that sense of belonging.
It's the thread that connects us, the story we tell ourselves about, who we are, where we come from. And in Korea's case, it's a story it's both epic and inspiring.
It really is. It's a story of a nation that faced impossible odds, and they came out of it with their spirit unbroken, their culture vibrant, their identity intact.
And on that note, we've come to the end of our deep dive into Korea, the unconquerable peninsula. But this is really just the start of the story. There's so much more to explore. The impact of Japanese colonization, the division of the peninsula, the rise of two very different Koreas. It's a history that's still being written. It's a testament to the enduring spirit of the Korean people. So keep exploring, keep learning, and we'll see you next time on The Deep Dive.